So I've noticed this thing happening since I walked away from my faith, that every once in a while I'll hear an argument that I used to use as a Christian, and I'll listen to it like I'm hearing it for the first time and go, well, how do you know that? Because I used to say quite a bit of stuff like I knew it was fact, but I had just heard it somewhere, probably from a preacher. And so I was listening to somebody talk a couple of days ago about the story of Elisha reaching Bethel, the one where, he asks God to send bears to murder a bunch of kids that are making fun of him for being bald. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, it's in Second Kings, by the way. So, Second Kings chapter 2 verses 23 through 25. He went up from there to Bethel, and while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go up, you bald head! Go up, you bald head!" And he turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And two she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. That's it. That's the whole story. It's 3 verses. So, how much interpretation can we really do? It's straightforward, right? There's a group of children who are not showing proper deference to a servant of the Lord, and the Lord punishes them. Bam, done, right? Well, maybe not. I had heard things about how the Hebrew was mistranslated, and really, rather than little boys, it should have been like teenagers and adolescents. But in looking at this, I didn't want to just conjure stuff up from memory, right? So instead, I did exactly what I would have done as a Christian, and I Googled it. And so I found a couple of really interesting articles by people who are way better educated than I am. And I just think we should walk through them together today and take a look at how much validity there is to the argument that if God in fact does exist and did in fact send bears out of the woods to kill people because his prophet asked him to, that's a good thing. So today, you and I are going to unpack the story of Elisha, the children, and the bears. My name's Ragabash Dabbler, but you can call me Rags. Let's talk. So when I was looking for this, I Googled something like Elisha bear attack, and I just looked for the first articles that wanted to contest the context that we generally think of it in. And the first one that I found was from 1517.org. It's written by a gentleman named Chad Bird. He's got multiple degrees. He speaks Hebrew. His beard is awesome. Frankly, I'm jealous of him in every way. But let's see what Chad has to say about the matter. So, the title of his article is The Misunderstood Story of Bear Attacks, a Bald Prophet, and 42 Mouthy Kids. So, it says this misunderstood story is not a moralistic tale about bald prophets and child eating bears designed to teach youths to honor their elders and preachers. Rather, it is a brief glimpse into the age old war that began in a garden and ended in an empty tomb. So he opens it by sort of calling back to a Sunday school experience that he remembers. I wouldn't soon forget that Sunday school lesson. The artwork told the whole story. There stood a prophet with a rapidly receding hairline, teeth gritted, his arm waving menacingly. Before him was a group of boys just about old enough for t-ball, writhing on the blood-spattered ground as two she-bears gnawed and tore at their limbs. First of all, can we just talk about the fact that these are things that we've been telling to children for thousands of years? Like, I remember this story from being a little kid and it being used as a cautionary tale. And while I know that lots of stories throughout human history have been really, really macabre and they do that because they know it's a way to get through to children, I mean, like we modified Grimm's fairy tales into Disney movies for a reason. There are certain things that are just not appropriate to be showing and telling to children. But anyway, that's not the point. That the way that he describes it is very much the way that I remember encountering it as a child. And yeah, when they flip open a picture Bible and there's a picture of kids being torn apart and running for their lives, sticks with you. So he goes on, the moral of the Bible story from 2 Kings 2:23 to 25 was this: pay honor to your elders, your church leaders, or you too might suffer a similar fate from the God who will not be mocked, or let his prophets be mocked. Now he's about to make the transition. Let's walk through this with him. As I reflect on this story some 40 odd years later, it seems I've spent just as much of my life unlearning bad biblical interpretation as I've spent learning good interpretation. Time out. Hold up. If this is God's love letter to his people, why are we able to misinterpret it? I don't know. It makes no sense to me. But okay, fine. I as well am familiar with the argument of I was taught wrong things about the Bible and had to relearn the right things or, train myself out of bad belief patterns. And I can respect that. If you believe the document is true and you believe that you've misunderstood it, then absolutely you should make an effort. I respect the guy. Just man, wouldn't it have been easier if God just made it so that we couldn't misunderstand this? Anyway, he goes on. What has come to my aid are three indispensable tools. One, knowledge of the original languages, in this case Hebrew. Two, understanding where smaller stories fit within the larger biblical story. And three, something the rabbis called Ma'asa Avat Siman Levanim. I'm sorry, I don't speak Hebrew, but translated, the actions of the fathers are a sign for the sons. Let me use each of these to retell the story in a way that explodes the ridiculous interpretation I learned in Sunday school and piece that rubble back together into an interpretation that accords with the rest of Scripture. I'm going to go with him on it. Let's take a look. The Hebrew does not say little children were mauled by bears. This is one of the arguments that I remember being told but not taught. He goes on, as much as I love the language of the King James Version, the translators really botched this one, as do many modern translations. When Elisha drew near to Bethel and a group of people mocked him, many versions say these were little children, KJV, boys, NIV, or small boys, ESV. The Hebrew phrase is a combination of the noun na'ar and the adjective katan. What do these mean? Good question. The word na'ar, which is often rendered as children or boys, has a broad range of meaning. He gives scriptural notes for where all of these occurrences happen, and we're going to go back and revisit them in just a second, but just to make it easier to read, we'll skip it. It can denote everyone from baby Moses to fully grown Absalom. A na'ar can also designate a servant, armor bearer, king's official, and significantly for us, a priest. So we need to pause here because he's given us um, verse citations of where the word na'ar is used to describe someone. And the claim is that it can be used to describe anyone at any stage of life. It's not necessarily a child. So let's look at the references that he's talking about. So first of all, he says that in Exodus 2:6, the word na'ar is applied to describe the baby Moses. So let's look at that verse. All of the readings, by the way, are going to be from the version, I believe it's the ESV, but from the version that they are directly linking to here. So I'm using specifically the version of the Bible that he's cited for us. I know that when we're talking about translation, that's not really the most important thing, but as somebody who doesn't have the tool of personal translation available to me, I have to look at where he's sending me and use context clues to figure out if I think that he's right or not. So for Moses, Exodus 2:6, it says, when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Okay, so whether it's the baby or the children or the child, it's all a reference to children. So that makes sense. That lines up with our classical interpretation. He's not contesting that. So then he says fully grown Absalom, and that one kind of caught me off guard. Let's just see what it says. 2 Samuel 14:21. Then the king said to Joab, behold, now I grant this. Go bring back the young man Absalom. Okay, so we have a couple of things happening in that passage. As it's translated here, he's directly referred to as a young man. But moreover, it's the king who's calling for him. And I think what we're going to find as we go is that anytime that word na'ar is used, when we look at it in the translation, we're going to see it's being spoken from someone in authority about someone who is subject to that authority. But that's just what I'm going with here. Let's keep going. Then it says it can designate a servant, and put a pin in that. We're going to be coming back to that servant thing later. The citation that he gives is Genesis 22:3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place, blah, 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 blah. The only references there are to Abraham, to Isaac, his son, or to two of his young men. So since Chad has already given us the clue that the word na'ar here is used to designate a servant, we can assume that the translation two of his young men is where that word na'ar would have been found to begin with. But the thing about that is, again, two of his young men, when talking about a servant or a slave, is again talking about somebody who is in a position of authority speaking to somebody who's subservient. The next one is an armor bearer, Judges 9:54. Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, draw your sword, blah, 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 blah. Again, same thing. This is somebody talking to somebody in a position of subservience. Also, I may be wrong about this specifically for when it goes to the ancient Israelites, but most of the time somebody who would be designated something like an armor bearer would be like a page or a servant, a young person who is better suited to helping other people prepare for battle than being worried about preparing for himself first. A king's official, that one's kind of vague. So this goes again into Second Kings. This one's Second Kings 19:6. Isaiah said to them, say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have reviled me. I guess this would be the servants of the king of Assyria. So again, it in reference to both the Lord and to the king, these would be people who are subservient. And then significantly for us, a priest, he says, 1 Samuel 2:17. Thus the sin of young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. Which, again, if we're talking about father to son, king to subject, the Lord to a man. It seems like the overarching theme with this Na'ar term is not that it's denoting specifically male people or people of a specific age, but people who are relatively subservient or inferior to the person they're being contrasted against. So then we're going to move on to the other piece of the Hebrew term that he's talking about, katan. The Hebrew adjective katan means small, little, or young. The question is how young. The same Hebrew combination, nar katan, is used to describe a mature rebel named Hadad the Edomite. Likewise, when Solomon takes the throne at the age of 20, he describes himself as a nar katan. Obviously, he and Hadad were not elementary-aged little boys. Okay, so then why did they use this word? Okay, but the references that he gives, all right. So when it comes to Hadad the Edomite, or Edomite, however you prefer to say it, the line that he quotes us is 1 Kings 11:17. And in the version that he quotes, it's the story of how Hadad came to leave Edom. Anyway, it's 1 Kings 11:17, but Hadad fled to Egypt together with certain Edomites of his father's servants. Hadad still being a little child. So it uses Na'ar Katan to talk about, yes, somebody who at the time of the telling is fully grown, but it's talking about a time when that person was a child. Okay. So then when did Solomon call himself a child? Because I think I know, and I think it's going to really piss me off. 1 Kings 3:7. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. This one makes me angry, not just because it's misleading, but because it shows blatant disregard for the context of one of the most famous stories in the Bible. So the story that this is pulled from is the wisdom of Solomon. The whole point of this statement is when God gives Solomon the opportunity to ask for something, Solomon considers it and says, I'm not ready to lead your people. I don't have the ability to properly discern between good and evil. I need to be more wise in order to do this for you, which pleases God. And then he makes him wiser than any man who has ever lived before or since, whatever. And so in this, he's not saying, I, as the king, am going to call myself an Archatan. He's literally saying, I am like a child. I don't understand the world well enough. Chad, I'm kind of disappointed in you right now. None of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 references that you've given us to inline verse citations. None of them prove what you say that they prove. All 8 of the inline verse citations that you gave us as written and in the context of the story actually make more sense if you understand that language can be used metaphorically. which is why I disagree with the conclusion that he gives us here. Thus, at a bare minimum, we can say it's highly unlikely that the people who mocked Elisha were little children or small boys. It's much more probable that A, these were young men, and B, they were called Na'ar, not in reference to their sex, male, but their office, servants. Again, remember, we've got a pin in that word servants. We're coming back to that. But I disagree with him because I don't think the context of anything that he's shown us so far makes it even remotely unlikely that the people who mocked Elisha were little children. I think if anything, it shows that it's possible if we regard the language as metaphorical and we try to read into what they were talking about from there. So then his next heading is, how does this small story fit within the big story? So the next section, I'm not going to read verbatim. It's more exposition than anything else. Essentially, he fills us in on what's happening at the time of the story in case you don't know. He goes into how Jeroboam founded Dan in the north and Bethel in the south as alternative sites of worship to Jerusalem, and how he had set up idols and they were worshiping the wrong god, and they ordained non-Aaronic priests, and lots of things that makes God sad. So you have this idolatrous, sinful city of people, and there are some young men that come out to meet him and make fun of him. Um, he mentions here that the reason they're saying go up is because Elijah, the prophet just before him, who had passed the torch on to him, had been carried to heaven in a flaming chariot because he was bodily carried to heaven because God liked him so much. But essentially, they're saying, hey, that guy that you used to hang out with all the time went up to heaven, you should follow him. So essentially, he's saying this fits into the larger narrative of the Bible where God commands certain things and other people follow other gods and the way that those things interact, which at least makes more sense than God murdering a bunch of children because they made fun of somebody. The next piece goes into the idea that Elisha was recreating the life of Joshua because prophets tend to copy each other, even going so far as to draw the parallel that Joshua called on the Lord and the Lord sent hornets before him to drive out the idolaters in Canaan. And this time Elisha called on God to help drive out idolaters, and he got bears and they ripped the idolaters apart. And then at the end of this section, he says, one more thing. I mentioned above that Na'ar is often a title for official, steward, servant, or priest, which I'm still iffy on that. Because this happened at Bethel, I suspect these were 42 priestly servants, remember that word, attached to that city's idolatrous shrine. They mocked and ridiculed Elisha because he opposed everything they and their gods stood for. Okay, cool. I'll go with you. I'll go with you on that. That regardless of who these people are, they were probably motivated more by the religious leanings of the city than the fact that Elisha was just some bald dude. And then his last paragraph is a bunch of purple prose about how it's not really a fight between kids and a bear, it's a fight between a serpent and a lamb, and blah blah blah. So I'm gonna give Chad like a 6 out of 10 on this one. I don't think that he proved his point that they were necessarily not children. But I do think that he did a good job of at least providing broader context to a layperson or a person who's like a Christmas Christian. So since I wasn't really satisfied with that answer, I kept looking. And the next article that I found is from christianindex.org. Paul Baxter is writing for the Christian Index. But let's just briefly take a look at what Mr. Baxter also has to say about this. So the title of his article is, why would God send a bear to maul children? Good question. Let's take a look. So he starts off by recounting the tale of being in a church and listening to a pastor tell his congregation this story, and the congregation going, wait, was that really in the Bible? Hold on. And he also mentions that people have written in asking him about this. His actual response starts about, I don't know, a third of the way down the article. He says, first and foremost, we must carefully and above all prayerfully examine the text. Too often, skeptics and critics of the Bible love to mischaracterize what the Bible says. And then he talks a little bit more about how other people have observed that the Bible can be mischaracterized at times by people who are not of the faith. So I think we're getting into it now. It says, let's look at the context of this story, verses 13 to 25, entitled Elisha Succeeds Elijah. It is about how Elisha was in a most challenging time of taking over from the great prophet Elijah, who was swept up into heaven in a chariot of fire. God endorses him as a successor to Elijah in dramatic and eye-catching ways. And then he talks about, again, being able to part a river to cross and, that sort of thing. And then he lists a few things, but the last thing that he lists is disciplining a gang of ruffians who were ridiculing and rejecting God and his prophet. Okay. So, who are these ruffians? We read how Elisha, the prophet of God, was entering one of the worst places in the corrupt and decadent nation of Israel. Although Bethel was called the house of God, what should have been a holy place was the center of idolatry and immorality, where the sons of God were vastly outnumbered by those who taunted and trashed the faith of Elisha and Elijah. Bethel was so bad that a gang of young teenagers harassed Elisha, taunting him to leave them and their town alone and go off to be with his God as Elijah had done. Gleason Archer puts everything in perspective when he describes this large roving band of teenagers as a serious public danger, quite as grave as the large youth gangs that roam the ghetto sections of our modern American cities. Okay, so now instead of just young people who were mocking him, they're now like the Bethel Bloods. Oh, and then okay, so then he cites the Apologetic Study Bible. He says that it explains the Hebrew phrase for small boys refers to adolescents from 12 to 30 years old. See 1 Samuel 20:35, 1 Kings 3:7, 11:17. It is unlikely that these youths were younger than 12 years old. Contrary to the character, Elisha was a young man, probably in his mid-20s, though obviously bald. Okay. So the references that he makes in First Kings are again the wisdom of Solomon and Hadad the Edomite, the ones that we already talked about. So these must be things that people love to throw out there. Like this must get circulated, right? But then he also cited First Samuel 20:35. This is the NIV. He didn't actually give me an inline link, so I just looked it up. I'm just pulling from the NIV. Sorry if that's not your preferred. But yeah, First Samuel 20:35. In the morning, Jonathan went out to the field for his meeting with David. He had a small boy with him, and he said to the boy, "Run and find the arrows I shoot." As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. So again, this is dealing. It's written here as a young boy, but at least in somebody who is in service to Jonathan. So I'm still not buying where they get that it could be somebody 12 to 30 years old just in general. These people have to be servants. Then he wraps it up by explaining that essentially this was God sending a warning to the people of Bethel through killing some of their kids. And if you go back to Leviticus, one of the things that it says if you're worshiping false gods is that he will send animals after you. And we'll get into that. But I can't let the servant thing go anymore. So let's talk about this. So the thing about servitude, the Bible always makes me really uncomfortable when they use the word servant. Because there are a lot of things that we would not agree with today that the Bible wholeheartedly endorses. And when I see phrases like priestly servant, it makes me wonder, could the church own people? As it turns out, yes, it could. So if you flip to Leviticus, Leviticus 27 is a list of guidelines for how to dedicate a person or thing to the Lord. Hey guys, Rags from the future here. I forgot to mention this when I was originally recording this, but some scholars believe that Leviticus 27 is actually moved from its original position in the Bible, and it really fits better immediately before chapter 25, which is all of the laws about slavery. So Leviticus 27 is essentially a guidebook for how to give something to the church, and it concentrates on a few big areas: real estate, livestock, and people. You would do this if you had poor harvests, or if you wanted divine favor, or if you just wanted to make God happy. And there are provisions in there if you wanted to consecrate someone to the church but not give them over as property. There was a monetary fee that you could pay, and that would be the equivalent of your service. And I read one scholar who said something to the effect of it probably wasn't utilized that much at the church, even if it owned people, probably didn't use them, and that there was an entire priesthood tradition already. They didn't really need all this excess labor. But when you get down to it, if somebody's giving me a free field and a free worker, I'm going to put that worker in the field. In fact, we have examples of different religious traditions around the world in all different cultures using indentured servitude and slave labor to build great things for themselves, from Angkor Wat to Jehovah's Witnesses building kingdom halls with volunteer labor and volunteer supplies. Even if these people paid the valuation, they may have seen it as their divine duty to go ahead and carry out the actions of the church, because after all, they were consecrated to the Lord. And again, we have evidence of people doing these things in a lot of different points in history. Think about Mormon missionaries. They pay for their own mission. Now, in fairness, there is one thing that I'd like to bring up here. The property laws outlined in Leviticus tend to work along the terms of jubilees, 7-year periods. So yes, you could consecrate somebody to the church for 7 years by paying the fine or asking them to physically serve the church. But technically, that period ended after a jubilee, unless you resubscribed. But there was no limit to how long you could go. And when we're talking about a civilization that encouraged chattel slavery of foreigners, as well as the proprietary ownership of everyone in a man's family, that has some pretty serious implications. By the way, your relative worth to the church would have been based on your gender assigned at birth and your age, because little kids and old people can't work as much as a man in his 20s. So now let's apply this to the story of Elisha. So while I'm not particularly familiar with Baal worship, I can't imagine that Yahweh was the only God at the time giving out this sort of quid pro quo arrangement with his followers. Think about the implication of somebody who's given to the church at a month old or a year old or 7 years old and told that you are the physical payment for a special covenant with God and that your life has been dedicated to the service of the temple. And think about the indoctrination that comes along with that. How outsized the importance of the church would be to you if that is the way the world's been explained to you. And now imagine somebody who is outspoken and angry with you for believing the things that you believe when you've never known anything else approaches the city. And you're a child, priestly servant. There's a group of you. And the older boys, they don't seem happy to see this person. Think you'd jump in there? Do you think that if you did, you'd deserve to be mauled by a bear? And ultimately, isn't that the thing that sticks in everybody's craw about this story? That it does not seem like an appropriate reciprocal action. Somebody is jeering at you, so you kill them? I know that it says that God will send beasts among you if you're disobedient. But it also says a lot of other things. Like there's supposed to be plagues and conquering armies and all kinds of stuff. And forgive me, but if I were an all-powerful God, I wouldn't try to send a message to people who didn't believe in me by sending two animals to do a thing that animals do in a place where those animals live, right? Like bears running out of the woods and attacking a group of people is a thing that happens. Like, I'd be way more impressed if God had two grizzly bears swim out of the ocean and land on the deck of the Scientology boat and explain to them in perfect English with no violence exactly the error of their ways. I'm not saying I would be convinced, but I'd be impressed. But this, really, what this looks like to me is Little Red Riding Hood, a cautionary tale, and not even an interesting one. Like I said, it's 3 sentences long. Basically, it's if you don't show respect to God, bears will eat you. And the thing that's so damaging about that is that a lot of us get told stories like that even to this day. I know that in talking to people, I've heard things like they were told that they would be murdered with fire falling from the heavens, or that God would do bad things to them or let demons get them and stop protecting them if they weren't the right kind of Christian. And I'm sure the same can be said for lots and lots and lots of other religions. So let me know. Tell me what you think. Like I put the links down where the links go, but jump in the comments, talk to me. Tell me what you think about this story. Were you raised with it? Was it ignored in your church? Because I know a lot of people didn't learn this story until they read the Bible for themselves. But it seems to be one that comes up over and over and over again on all sides of the debate around God. And I find it interesting. And it was kind of fun to go back and revisit something that I grew up believing was true as a received opinion and then investigating it for myself. Also, a friend of mine texts me every time I put up a video and yells at me because I don't tell people to like and subscribe and share. So like and subscribe and share or dislike. If you don't like it, let me know. And if there's anything else that you want me to like kind of pick at, let me know that too. Put that in the comments. I really enjoy hearing from people, even people who disagree with me, and I try to read and respond to every comment. I think that's about it for today. But thanks for hanging in there, and I'll see you guys next time. You're a good dog. Thank you.